term romantic while being very useful for a book. And the platform that I set out to build for this broader community, we realized it's too controversial or it's too polarizing. There's some people who read it as like the HR department's like, oh no, we don't want to be romantic. That's the last thing we want. Or I just don't want to go there. And beautiful is just the broader canvas. Everybody wants to live a beautiful life. Everybody wants beauty. Like no one would ever raise their hand and say, no, I'm not interested in beauty. So it struck us as a really great kind of projection field. And the house, we felt like, we want to have a home for that, so a sense of belonging. But while we were tempted, we thank God, I think we never really fell prey to this desire to build something robust or, an actual house, a physical building. So I think the house is really a metaphor, and it must remain virtual.
I'm Brandon Vaidyanathan, and this is Beauty at Work, a podcast about how beauty works in our world and shapes the work that we do. This episode is sponsored by Templeton Religion Trust and the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies at the University of Southern California. More about them later in the show. Hey everybody, welcome. Thanks for joining us. I am so thrilled to introduce my guest today, Tim Leberecht. He's a German-American author and entrepreneur and the co-founder and CEO of the House of Beautiful Business. It's a global think tank and community with a mission to make humans more human and business more beautiful. Previously, Tim served as the chief marketing officer of NBBJ, a global design and architecture firm. And then from 2006 to 2013, he was the chief marketing officer of product design and innovation consultancy Frog Design. Tim is the author of the book, The Business Romantic, which was released in 2015, and it's been translated into 9 languages or more to date. And his writing regularly appears in a number of publications like Entrepreneur, Fast Company, Forbes, Fortune, Harvard Business Review, and so on. And his second book, The End of Winning, was released in German in 2020, and Tim is working on a new book, which he'll tell us today. Tim, thank you so much for joining us. It's such a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks so much, Brandon. It's great to see you again. I'm really happy to be here.
Great. Tim, let's start with your background, with your childhood growing up. What role did beauty play in your life? Because you have a mix of an artistic and business background, right? Your grandfather, I think, was a filmmaker, and your father a businessman, and then you were a musician. Could you if you could just talk through what role beauty played in your life through all of that.
Yeah, no, it's funny you asked that question, Brent, because I'm actually in my father's and my parents' house near Stuttgart in the south of Germany. So you can see, actually, if I get out of the way, you see some photos on the wall, and one of them actually, you can't probably see it, but one of them shows me playing the guitar because I played in a band called Migraine. The music was anything but migraine-esque. It was much more sort of very mellow chanson, soft jazz, singer-songwriter, Tom Waits kind of stuff.
Lovely.
When I think I was 21, 22, 23 or so, we released 2 albums actually, and I sang and played the guitar. It was a wonderful time. That was the first time I think I ever really pursued something artistic. But even when I was younger, during my teenage years, I always wanted to be a curator, a publisher. I created fictitious magazines, fictitious TV shows. I did some fake sports commentary. I had a whole publishing group, an empire, in fact.
Wow.
Wow. And I was always very interested in music and just creating stuff, creating other worlds, creating experiences. And it's funny that I came back to that just a few years ago, or 6 years ago, when I created the house, co-founded the House of Beautiful Business. I grew up in a very suburban, middle class kind of town near Stuttgart, which is home to Daimler and Porsche and a lot of industry, automotive industry, Bosch. And it's not particularly, I have to be careful being in my parents' house here, but it's not a part of the world that people would on the surface call particularly beautiful or idyllic. Although it is very interesting, it's very Calvinist, and there's been a lot of philosophers, from here. The car was famously invented here by Carl Benz and Gottlieb Daimler, the namesake patron of Daimler. So there's a lot of history here, and it's a very industrious sort of Calvinist ethos, I guess. But also very creative. So that's how I grew up, in a very safe, nothing to worry about, very privileged middle class German family. But my late mother, was probably the one who brought me to the arts and took me to classical concerts and ballet, and
Mm.
sort of introduced me to the beauties of a sentimental education and the arts and the knowledge that these arts contain. And then I studied law. I mean, I just kind of shortened the long story, but I studied law, and then through some digressions, I ended up actually in marketing. And then marketing to me was like the most creative discipline of business. So from there, then I worked for a design firm in Silicon Valley, for 7 years, wrote my book, and I kind of came back to my beginnings and the things that I was interested in when I was a teenager. And I wrote The Business Romantic, and then co-founded the House of Beautiful Business. And now I'm doing exactly, funny enough, I'm 51. I'm doing exactly what I wanted to do when I was 16, but it's taking me
Wow.
30 years, at least to I think muster the courage and acknowledge that that's really what I need to do and nothing else.
What was it that you were trying to do when you were 16? I mean, you had this publishing empire, you were curating. Could you say a bit more about what was that? What was the seed there?
I think the seed was, I mean, I read a lot when I was, a teenager. I was very much into art house movies and the French Nouvelle Vague and independent movies
Mm.
and James Joyce. I never read
Wow.
Ulysses. Like, I read the monologue of Molly Bloom, the very end of it, and I read short stories, but never the full book. But I was a very sort of heady, you know, child, and I had friends, but I was also kind of a loner, and so I think I just sat in my room and created my own worlds, and I wrote a lot.
Mm.
I wanted to become a writer, and I wrote screenplays and and movies, but it was all sort of fictitious stuff, right? I had a radio show that my
Right.
poor little brother had to be a guest on. So it's funny how, I mean, I was a
Great.
very
Great.
imaginative child in a way, and then this is sort of, I guess, Sir Ken Robinson's thesis, right? So we then lose this imagination of a child through our education, and sort of
Mm.
this rationalist view that is impressed on us, and then it takes quite some time
Mhm.
to rediscover it.
Yeah. Talk about the origins of your sort of romantic the ethos in your life. I mean, did you is that was that a word that you sort of identified with at a certain point
Mhm.
and say, gosh, this is what I am and this is what expresses what I've been striving to do, and how did that come about?
I never really consciously used it until I wrote the book, which was
Ah.
in I think I started writing in 2012. And I
Hmm.
remember that moment. I was working on the proposal with an editor and my agent, and this is my first book. And the book was supposed to be called Chief Meaning Officer. Thank God it didn't wasn't published with that title in hindsight. But I realized as I was describing the principles of meaning making as they made sense to me in business, in and through business. And it was really an epiphany when I realized that all of these principles give more than you
Mm.
take. Dwell in mystery and mystique, honor the silence, lose yourself, lose without losing. So lose yourself,
Mm.
surrender. There's others. I don't even remember them all now, but they were all romantic principles, and it struck me when I
Mm.
looked at them. It's like, oh my God, these are all tropes of romanticism, of the arts and literature, philosophy movement of the 18th, 19th century. That was a response
Yeah.
to the Enlightenment, but I had never used that. I had never articulated that for me before, even though when I was 16, 17, 18, I think I've always lived my life that way. So our music,
Mm.
the music we made with our band Migraine, was very romantic. It was very kind of, it was full of longing and heartbreak.
Mm.
And also I remember the first city that I frequently drove to, because it's not that far from my hometown, 5, 6 hour car drive or train ride, is Paris. So I went to Paris a lot.
Mm.
And Paris, I really cherished and loved. For me, it was just like the most romantic destination, and an escape from this rather, gray industrial town that I grew up in, and sort of the German, what I thought was a very stifling, narrow German psyche at the time.
Mm.
So yeah, that's maybe how it all started. Paris.
What inspired you to write the book? What prompted that?
The book was, I think, the result of many years of suffering in
Hmm.
business. So,
Mm.
so from law, which I never finished, I never got a degree. Then I studied
Mm.
applied cultural studies, which was a crude mix of Wittgenstein and accounting. So I had
Wow.
business classes, And then I had philosophy. It was interesting, and it was kind of
Mm.
it enabled students to pursue a career in the arts or arts management or marketing, and that's exactly where I ended up.
Mm.
And then I worked in Silicon Valley for a while. It was in the beginning incredibly thrilling and eye-opening and super interesting and competitive. And I sort of felt like, oh my God, this is sort of the time of my life. But after a while, I became a bit homesick, and
Mm.
Silicon Valley became so just adamant and fervent about dataism and considering data
Right.
the only truth, and this whole idea of solutionism based on this fact that you can engineer anything, right? There's an engineering solution, not only to like a software problem, but a policy problem or a
Mm.
relationship problem. In fact, any problem in the world. That struck me as very myopic.
Mm.
And after a while in business, I think I realized, and I remember actually that there was a meeting. I was chief marketing officer at the time of the design company's parent group, which was owned by private equity, by KKR, like one of the
Mm.
world's largest private equity firms. They were at least a large investor, and I was in board meetings, and I was just so I loved the adventure of it. And I felt like a complete alien and outsider, and I loved observing it, almost like an ethnographer. But I also thought, oh my God, these guys are brilliant. They're super smart, but they have absolutely no idea about culture and sort of
Mm.
the sort of the tones in between, the nuances, and how much damage they're doing also with their number crunching mindset to the whims and woes and nuances of culture, and how much value they're actually destroying, by merging companies and behaving that way. So I was sort of in awe, but also completely shocked. And I think that was the spark for me to say, after probably 10 years or so in executive positions, no, I need to now write down my truth. And my truth is actually harkening back to where I came from. And it's a somewhat European, probably sentimental, romantic truth. And there is a space where I want to carve out a space for it in business. And I had begun to write and give talks. And I also felt encouraged by the fact that, they were resonant. So people just, it struck a chord, or people were interested in these ideas, which
Mm.
surprised me, and then really, I think, gave me the courage to, yeah, pursue this book idea.
Yeah, wow, right. Had you encountered any examples of, because I mean often the response to that sort of critique is you're just being sentimental and naive, and business can't really run unless it's
Mm,
really, Taylorian, right? I mean, I was really struck by the resonances in your book and in your talks about how so much of what you were responding to seems like a new Taylorism, right? The
mm,
mode, the re-engineering, and even your new book around winning. I don't know if that word is in any way responding to Jack Welch. I mean, he has a memoir called Winning,
mm,
or I think it's a biography written by his wife. And Welch is, I think, the kind of prototype, or the archetype of this new re-engineering, the new Taylorism, right? Really kind of hyper rationalist, very anti-humanist in some way, because that he was called Neutron Jack because he would go into buildings and destroy them and leave the people, get rid of the people and leave the buildings standing like neutron bombs, right? So it seems like there's this sort of a call for a new romantic movement that emerges when there is a new rationalism that has taken hold. I don't know if
yeah.
that's accurate reading.
I think that's quite accurate, and I think that's historically always been the case, right? Whenever the pendulum swung to a very rational, super
Mm.
optimizing, hyper efficient mindset, when it became very binary in that sense, there was always this counter movement that was by design somewhat
Mm.
subversive. So I think the romantic movement back then, and if there is one right now, is coming from the pockets, right? It's coming from the underground. It's not a top down framework, that is kind of an ideology. It's more like pockets of resistance that also makes
Mm.
it romantic, right? In a way.
Yeah, yeah. Were there examples that had given you confidence that this is actually business can actually work this way? It won't, it's not just a sort of sentimental reaction, but you can actually succeed in business by following these principles. Did you find any exemplars?
Yeah, I mean, I first of all, it was definitely the company that I worked at the time, Frog
Mm.
Design, which was founded by the legendary German industrial designer Hartmut Essinger, who had worked for Apple in the 80s and
Mm.
90s, and Steve Jobs, and I heard many stories about Steve Jobs because they worked very closely together, is an interesting figure in that regard because he is both, in a way, hyper romantic, because he believes in the invisible, in the interior of products, right,
Mm.
and not necessarily in the metrics or the external metrics at least. But at the same time, he's also like a hyper driven, very rational
Yeah.
business mind, right? So he was able to reconcile both of these somewhat opposing minds and still retain the ability to function, to quote Scott Fitzgerald. So Frog was a place like that. And it was very
Mm.
much because of the founder Hardmood. It was a very romantic, dramatic place, full of adventure, also dark in a way. It was very hard to read. Every day when you went there, you didn't know what to expect. Now, that can be very off-putting and unsettling, but it's also, I think, at least for me at the time, it was a million times more interesting than a work routine that would have been boring and very consistent. So I saw that as an example, and I also for the book then interviewed architects, startup founders. I spent time with Priya Parker, the author of the book The Art of Gathering, which came out many years
Right.
later, who had just started her practice, and we both served on the World Economic Forum Agenda Council on Values, and so we had many conversations about there was always a conversation about ethics and doing good
Mm.
and conscious capitalism and purpose. But for me, that conversation always struck me as still somewhat technocratic. It was very
Yeah.
cold. And so I
Uh-huh.
was always looking for the intimacy and the beauty that a novel or a film or any other piece of art might capture, and then express that in business. I remember that I began to host events. I ran a hackathon that was still a thing
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
early
Yeah.
in 2010 or 2011 about that was called Reimagining Work or so. That was with
Mm.
the World Economic Forum and some other partners. And yeah, and I think those were sort of early attempts to find the soul of business. I was inspired by the works of David Whyte, the philosopher and poet who has written a lot about um, corporations and beauty in a way, and corporations and meaning. I was attracted by cultures such as Chanel, the fact that they onboard executives through a really kind of, yeah, Proustian sentimental education. So really kind of like honing their faculties, their
Mm.
sensibilities, embracing arts and reading and interpreting the world and its sublime beauty and developing a sensorial apparatus for that rather than just being a skill-based functioning machine. And then once I had that lens on, of course, what happens is you see more and the world is suddenly, appears romantic to you, and you see more and more businesses. I remember interviewing the founder of a series called Death Over Dinner that started
Mm.
in Seattle, and it became a movement in the US where people over dinner had conversations about the ultimate taboo, especially at work, which is death and grief and loss. It's also a
Wow.
theme, as you might remember, that we just covered uh, quite extensively
Yeah.
actually at our recent festival. So I think all of these things came together, and suddenly I realized, oh my God, like the reality that we were taught, that we were conditioned to embrace as the mainstream reality, it's just a narrow slice of what's happening.
Mm.
People want more. There is more. And now many years later, with the House of Beautiful Business and our work and the client work that we do, but also the festivals and experiences that we put on ourselves, that's exactly what we want to create. We want to create a space to show that other side of that the broader range of emotions of our humanity is possible in business, and it is.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it reminds me a lot. I mean, there's a lot in the romantic critique. I think that's really important and valuable. I think it needs to constantly be brought to surface. I mean, the work I've done with scientists in many ways, I think, I've been studying the role of beauty in science, and many of the critiques of science are I think similar to the critiques of rationalism because they're all about the
Mm,
reductionism, right? The stripping
mm,
away of mystery and of beauty. Keats, famously complained that Newton had destroyed the poetry of the rainbow by reducing it to the prismatic colors and so on. And Keats himself was a scientist himself. Like he wasn't just a naive, sort of uh, wishful thinker. Like he was himself aware of the power and beauty of science, and yet I think he was really concerned about the way in which relying exclusively on that reductive dimension can be really problematic. And I think it's important to, even though scientists now have started pushing back and are more willing to talk about beauty and science more openly. It's not something they focus on, and I think that's what needs to be brought to light. That even in business, even in accounting, or even in in Silicon Valley, that there's a lot that is to be treasured. That there's a lot of mystery and there's a lot of magic, even in the process of what seems like hyper rationalist engineering, right? And it seems like your work is trying to shed a light on those aspects of business.
Hmm.
Talk about the origin of the House of Beautiful Business, and even the word beautiful. How did that come about?
Well, I had written this book, The Business Romantic, and it came out in 2015. And around the book, I think there was an interest in forming a community. So I wanted to do an event. That was really the spark for the first gathering. And my longtime colleague and friend, Till Grusch, also a fellow German, our paths crossed again just at the right time. So we decided to do a gathering in Barcelona in Spain.
Hmm.
And initially, the idea was really to create the most romantic business conference that the world had ever seen, like silent dinners, opera singers, exhibitions, very different kind of programming, but still, and this is, I think, a hallmark of the house, hopefully, bridging back to the pragmatic and day-to-day needs of business. So we don't want to be completely woo-woo and out there, but we want to bring fringe and unorthodox ideas to an orthodox space, and without alienating, I guess, the people who attend. And
Hmm.
the term, and for that very reason, the term romantic, while being very useful for a book, and the platform that I set out to build for this broader community, we realized it's too controversial, or it's too polarizing. There's some
Huh.
people who read it as like HR departments, like, oh no, we don't want to be romantic. That's the last
Right.
thing we want. Or I just don't want to go there. And
Right. Right.
beautiful is
Right.
just a broader canvas. I mean, everybody wants to live a beautiful life. Everybody wants beauty.
Hmm.
Like, no one would ever raise their hand and say, no, I'm not interested in beauty. So it struck us as a really great kind of projection field. And the house, we felt like, yeah, we want to have a home for that. So a sense of belonging. But why we were tempted, we thank God, I think we never really fell prey to this desire to build something robust, or an actual house, a physical building. So I think the house is really a metaphor, and it must remain virtual. And
Hmm.
so we meet every day. The team meets every day. Every once a year we meet. We host a big festival. We've now moved
Yeah.
to Portugal. We did one online during COVID, and then we have a number of online sessions. And we now call ourselves the Network for the Life-Centered Economy, which is a term that we didn't invent. It's been around since the Club of Rome discussions, but it's so relevant and urgent now, and it's a good one. And it means
Hmm.
that we want to create a business, and this is maybe the definition of beautiful business. It's a business that honors all life around us and all life inside us,
Hmm.
which brings to mind emotional diversity, cognitive diversity, cultural diversity, more inclusive, more fluid, more deeper manifestations of creativity and innovation, and value creation, than the very reductionist sort of movement and management theory have sort of
Hmm.
made us believe are possible. And yeah, the house has grown. It started as an event. It's evolved into a community of more than 30,000 people, with more than 30 local chapters all around the world. Very vibrant community that is, to a large degree self-organized. And
Hmm.
we see ourselves as it's partly, I guess, a movement. I'm kind of careful with that term, but it's a community that is actually, I feel like, quite real now, after 6 years, that has really grown roots and branches and has a real body. It's real. I think there's intimacy there as a main currency. But we also produce a lot of thought leadership. So we publish a lot, we do reports, and we do a lot of client work. So we work with many Fortune 500 companies, and we help them envision a life-centered economy. We help them map out what that might mean for them, and we help them, most importantly, to create events, experiences, and stories that
Hmm.
that really touch them on an emotional not only an intellectual and emotional and a somatic bodily level, and that's a key lever for change. So yeah,
Yeah,
that's where
yeah.
we're at.
Fantastic. Could you talk a bit about the transition from human-centered to
Mhm.
life-centered? Because I think that's one shift I've seen in your work, and the other thing, if you could touch on, is just even if you could give one example of one of these organizations. You don't have to name the company, but just the kind of change that you've been
Mhm.
able to bring about in trying to create this sort of life-centered business.
Yeah. Um, the human-centered economy has been the holy grail, right, for a while. I mean, it was like the lowest common denominator. Everybody could agree on human-centered
Hmm.
products, human-centered experiences. IDEO, the design firm that was our
Yeah.
main rival when I worked at Frog Design, that really did a remarkable job in promoting design thinking and broadening the remit of design.
Mm.
Uh, Also really famously propagated the idea of human factors, right? So let's start with personas. Let's look at the human needs. You know, if you look at Maslow's pyramid of needs, of course, also maybe all the ones that are a little bit more subtle, the social needs that we have, the spiritual needs that we have, and then design for that based on this premise that the human is at the center of all things. And that would inevitably lead to a more humane economy. The shift that that we have made, and I think the world is also making, if I sort of scan the world around me correctly, is this realization that that's just not good enough and has led to so many externalities, whether that is our mental health, sort of this focus on we need to optimize our humanity in a way and bring
Mm.
most of our humanity and bring it to work. It has led to a lot of disconnection and alienation from nature, from the other. It has led to the fact that I think convenience and comfort have probably been over-indexed when designing workplace and product experiences. And I think most importantly, of course, climate change and the climate crisis and the damage that we've done to our natural habitat. And also, I think the disneglect for other life, other species around us, has probably to do with the fact that we've had this very human-centered, myopic mindset. So the life-centered economy goes beyond that. So as I said earlier, it acknowledges all life inside us. So not just the positive emotions, not just experiences that are designed to make us happy all the time, but
Hmm.
also workplaces that allow us to be sad and angry and inconsistent and complicated and struggling, because that's who we
Mm.
are. And hard to read and
Yeah.
unintelligible. And
Right.
then secondly, I think it's an economy that honors all life around us, as in uh, heightening, expanding our consciousness, being aware of the cycles of nature, whether that's the circular economy or designing work more in a cyclical fashion where there's moments of rest and harvesting and
Mm.
recharging and rebirth and grief, as nature sort of tells us. Um, so I think those are, and also I think a renaissance of the spiritual and the physical, the somatic, like reconnecting with the soil, with the earth, with our bodies, and the knowledge that it contains, not just the intellectual knowledge that we have in our heads, and also with spiritual practices. It's a word that I would not have used 5, 6 years
Mm.
ago. It didn't use it in my book. Now I feel like the business world is ready for it, and we see it pop up. And I just came back from you ask about examples of work. I just came back from a partner summit that we helped curate and host and produce for a big talent search consulting firm, and they used human design. So human design is a framework that is based on Kabbalistic wisdom and other spiritual. It's a hodgepodge, a mix of various
Mm.
practices, but essentially it dissects and identifies the energy types of people, and then helps leaders assemble teams and make staffing decisions and career decisions and strategy decisions based on energy. And that's really interesting. It's more accessible than other spiritual practices, I think, because it has very practical value. But we see organizations use that. We did with a big car maker for which we ran a leadership session. We looked at auric cleansing, so looking at the energy in rooms and things that have happened in rooms before they entered, and raising awareness of
Mm.
energy as something that is hard to quantify, but it's there, it's present, and it's a matter
Mm.
that affects how we make decisions and behave in business. We orchestrate longer term leadership journeys where we then bring in speakers and we create experiences. We go to interesting places. We push people gently out of their comfort zone.
Yeah.
But we also do interventions for, like, we're actually doing one next week in London with a fashion brand where it's also a leadership development program where we're playing with AI and what could make AI more beautiful and things like that. So yeah, I think it's all what we call experiential thought leadership. So taking ideas that are from disciplines that have been long neglected, bringing them into the arena of business, but doing it in a very theatrical, immersive, entertaining even fashion, right? So that it really is something that moves people.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's fantastic. I mean, when I started out, I started out my undergraduate career wanting to be an engineer, like most Indians who come to the West. So I grew up in the Middle East, and I moved to Canada for college, and I started out in engineering. I quickly switched to business, mainly because I was interested in understanding why people worked and what the questions around why work is meaningful and what does meaningful work look like. And so there were two kinds of questions there. One had to do with is there such a thing as meaningful work, and in a kind of more philosophical sense, like what is meaningful about work? Is there a purpose to work, and why do we do this? But then who does it and how do they do it? And those questions led me to what was then, in the management literature, a burgeoning sort of series of journal articles on spirituality in the
Mm-hmm.
workplace. And so this movement had started in the 90s and still is pretty alive in the management world and in the academy. But even then, in the early 2000s, when I was doing my undergrad thesis and so on, I was starting to see just a lot of concerns about the abuse of spirituality, right? So once you start to have companies leverage spirituality as a means to success, as a means to productivity, there are all kinds of prospects for abuse. And I'm just curious to know how you see that surfacing, because it's such an intimate and sacred part of who we are, and a lot of people on the one hand want to be whole persons and they want to be really integrated, and other people want more separation to say, I don't want my company messing with things that are really important to me. I'm just curious to see how that uh, fits in the work you do, how those tensions emerge.
It's a real concern, and it's one that we very often talk about and we're very aware of. And this notion of bring your full self to work can be quite intimidating, and it can be a tyranny, of emotional performance, right? Where you're now
Mm,
supposed to show up and you need to be
right.
vulnerable. That became sort of a thing,
Yeah.
right? And it's almost
Yeah.
like your performance is now measured on the grounds of, like, are you how high is your emotional intelligence, your social intelligence? Can you be
Mm,
vulnerable? And if you're not,
right.
what is wrong with you? Which is ironic. And so I think the key thing is here just to give choices. Not everybody wants
Mm,
all of their desires and needs fulfilled by their work. They're quite happy with a
yeah.
30-hour, 40-hour work week or less, ideally less. We've seen all the research
Yeah.
showing that 3-4 day work weeks are quite conducive to better outcomes in business. Um, so I think that the choice is really important. But I think ultimately, because we spend so much time at work, 75%, I believe, of our waking hours as knowledge workers. I think the question is, right, so work, if you define it as an amount of energy devoted to something over distance, the question
Mm,
is, what do you devote your energy to, if not
mm,
work? And what is work to begin with? So it depends a little bit, and I know this is not everybody has sort of this privilege of being able to even pursue the work that is purposeful and meaningful to them and have their
yeah.
energy and the time they spend match in the
Yeah.
best possible fashion. But I think we should, if we can, within the confines that are inevitably there, we should at least try. And I think what we're trying to do is just open up a possibility space. So if people want to be more vulnerable, if they want to
Mm,
experience emotional intimacy at work, and by the way, we should also in this context mention the loneliness crisis that is
yeah.
so blatant and outrageous in a way. And workplaces, of course, more than any other societal institution, I would argue, with sort of the secularization of our Western societies, has they have the power and perhaps the responsibility as well to create intimacy. We know that intimacy is the antidote to
Yeah.
loneliness. And it doesn't even matter
Yeah.
whether it's a very close relationship to a very close confidante or friend. What matters is the small moment of attachment, as the marriage or relationship researcher John Gottman says, right? So if you have a lot of micro moments of attachment, and they're even with strangers, you have moments of intimacy, I think that can fuel you, that can mitigate any sensation of loneliness. And loneliness also comes from the fact, I think, that your energy and who you are, who you truly are, is not really matched by what you do. I think that leads to burnout, that leads to stress, that leads to trauma, that leads to, I think, depression, and to loneliness, right? Also being lonely
Yeah.
with yourself. So we try to do what we can, but I think we're trying not to become cynical. So of course instrumentalize you can instrumentalize mindfulness, you can instrumentalize
Yeah.
the types of experiences that we create, and then say, oh, this is all great because it's going to make us more productive, or it's going to help us
Right.
make more money, and that's it. Whatever it takes. And if it's spiritual, great. Let's use it. And that's of course a real pity, but I still think introducing these practices to business, no matter the intentions in the beginning, even if it's in the guise of enhancing productivity, which is much easier for many managers to make a case for, once it's
Yeah.
there and once the value is recognized and once it's experienced, maybe my hope is it'll take a life on its own, and then it will develop so much momentum and force that this instrumentalism, this utilitarian mindset might be overcome. So
Right. Right.
that
Yeah.
that I
Yeah.
think that's the hope that I have, at least.
Yeah. No, I think, yeah, no, that's, yeah, because on the one hand, I don't think having workplaces where people feel sort of spiritually manipulated is a good thing. On the other hand, you
Yeah.
have um, often workplaces that are rife with loneliness, right? And that they're alienating and dehumanizing, and that experience doesn't need to be there either. And so I know there's increasingly this desire, which, I mean, I think the success of the recent book, The Good Enough Job, Simone Stolzoff's book, I think speaks to the fact that people, are realizing that maybe this pursuit of work as a be all and end all, the kind of workism, um, the expectation that work should fulfill every aspect of my life is a bit,
Mhm.
it's not working. Um, but at the same time, I think that the alternative doesn't have to be that the workplace is really, the kind of Taylorist, rationalist, alienating kind of workplace either, right? And I do think, though, that like one of the things that occurs to me, and it's the same not just in the workplace but in the university, is that you have people coming to you who are
Mhm.
really struggling with loneliness, with mental health challenges, and part of it is that I think a lot of our social institutions have stopped functioning. Families have stopped functioning well. Schools have stopped functioning well.
Mhm.
And so we've recently been having some debates at our university as to whether, like, what is the purpose of university anymore? Are we simply about a space where people download some knowledge into their heads, or is this a space where people need to learn how, like, should we be spaces of hospitality? So I've been trying to think about what it means to create classrooms that are spaces of hospitality and encounter, rather than just a place where you go and passively consume some knowledge. Partly because I think people are not capable of learning unless those basic emotional needs can be met, unless they can feel the
Mhm.
sense of psychological safety, and that somebody here is invested in their well-being, right? So I
Mhm.
think even with work, it's one of those things where I don't think you can really bring yourself, and even if you're drawing rigid boundaries around work and saying I'm only going to work 20 hours a week or 30 hours a week and I'm not going to bring my full self and they don't need to know who I am, you still need to experience, I think, a sense that this is a space of hospitality where I am welcome. um, so I'm just curious about the role of hospitality then, but also about whether you see business as a kind of surrogate institution in some way in providing what maybe other institutions and associations, are supposed to provide, but those things don't exist or function very well. Families don't function well, or sports clubs don't seem to function well. And is it the job of business then to provide that?
Yeah, I mean, oh, there's so much in your question. I think those are really interesting observations. We when we like looking at our own team, uh, many many of our colleagues are Gen Z, Gen
Mm,
Y. They have stopped looking for meaning only at work, right? Or the formalized
mm-hmm.
work, and many of
Yeah.
them have very flexible setups, and they have passion projects on the side. They have a side hustle, and it's not even a side hustle. It's just another work activity. So I think the notion of work has become much more holistic, and it's no longer tied to employment or to the one thing that defines you, that grants you identity, that you do. And I think that's really important. It's also important that we do work even if we are not working.
Yeah.
So, I'm thinking of, for example, the whole rest movement, Trisha Hersey in Atlanta, the nap ministry, and sort of
Mm-hmm.
napping and resting as resistance to this
Mm.
pressure of constantly having to perform and to advance your career and to optimize. And I was just reading the Prophet by Khalil Gibran and his really beautiful letters to Mary Haskell, and she writes back to him and says, I want you to know that even if you're not writing, if you're not producing something, you're always working, right? So your
Yeah.
silence and the pauses and the times in which you don't work but reflect, they are your work. They are your
Mm.
life's work, perhaps even more than what you actually produce. Now, that's an artist, and that's a very different life reality. But I do think that we need to begin to understand the right question to ask is, what is our life's work? How much of that is in
Mm.
employment, how much of that is as
Mm.
parents, how much of that is as a friend, as romantic lovers and partners. So where, how do we manifest ourselves, and how do we bring what only we can bring to the world? That's the work we have to do. No matter, it can be various
Mm.
platforms and channels. And this brings me to the question you had about hospitality. uh,
Mm.
and this goes back to Priya Parker's work as well, who
Mm.
asked this question: what does it mean to be a good host? She also asked, what does it mean
Yeah.
to be a good guest? But since
Right.
we talked about hospitality, what does it mean to be a good host? And it's a good question for business leaders and organizations, not only for the customers in relationship to the customers, but also their team members and society at large. How can we be a good host, and what does it mean to create hospitality? Now, the one thing I would say about classrooms and at universities is that I think more than anything else, I would argue that yes, they need to be temples of hospitality and they need to create a sense of belonging. But I think that belonging is not the same as fitting in. So
Mm.
belonging is probably quite the opposite of fitting in. It means that you can be who you are without the need to fit in and
Right.
to attune. And I think the one thing that I appreciated about going to high school and then my post grad or master's degree in Los Angeles is, I think the one thing that school or educational institutions can provide is like there are spaces where we can learn to disagree. So I think it's not
Mm.
just about validation, but it's actually like,
Yeah.
let's learn how to fight, the good fight,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
defend our views and change our views and battle and have debates and learn to disagree respectfully and still have a relationship to someone who's maybe not like-minded. And we don't have
Right.
enough of these institutions, and so I think that's really, really
Yeah.
important. And I hope that we don't design that out of the system in an effort to produce functional, employable individuals who, are cogs in the wheel and work for the machine, but rather that we help people individuate and
Yeah.
find their true selves to then do what is their life's work.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's really brilliant. I mean, it's so necessary in our polarized times. We want to sort ourselves into our camps, into our little bubbles where everybody believes exactly the same thing, right? And we don't really know how to be with people who disagree. I was very struck by the festival that you hosted, the Dream, that was this year's Festival of the House of Beautiful Business. I was only there for a day, for about 24 hours, and yet I think that it was probably the first experience I've had in maybe some 20 years where I could quickly connect with complete strangers and really build genuine friendship. I mean, I've made some really wonderful friends there whom I'm still in touch with just from that one day. And I'm still in awe of what you guys did. Like, how did you create this experience? What is your secret sauce, or what's the principle? What are the kind of ingredients that go into creating something like this? I don't know what stands out to you as being sort of the like what it would take for others to do something like this. Because for me, this it was such a beautiful experience, and I'm still in awe of yeah the ability to create the context in which these kinds of genuinely human interactions and intimate connections can happen.
Well, thank you so much, first of all, Brandon. That really means a lot, and thank you for coming over for one day from DC. I believe that was quite a commitment. I believe at the end of the day, I can give you some specific beliefs that we have and experiences, but I think at the end of the day, I think it works because our heart is in the right place,
Mm,
and that's what people sense. And the people who come, they come with genuine interest in one another, not a
mm,
transactional agenda. And there's a few things in which we manifest that or that might help create that kind of context and environment. One is that, as you may have noticed, we don't have name badges. So this
mm,
is in an effort to avoid that people look at their name, their badges, and trying to figure out whether it's worth having a conversation with
mm,
Brandon, because he's not a CEO. Like, what is in it for me? And of
mm,
course, that's a real pity because often we discover things, or we basically prevent ourselves from discovering things that are quite important, and then strike friendship. So business is always a byproduct of our gatherings, but it's never the foremost purpose or
mm,
reason why people connect. They want to connect because they want to get to know each other in different views. And we didn't have screens at the event. We try to design times of decompression and nothingness where people can just
mm,
sit still and connect with each other and have longer conversations. We challenge their views, we inspire, we bring music, the arts, dance, other experiences into the mix. And but I believe at the end of the day, it's really the intimacy and it's this the genuine intention of the people who are there. And this is also a community that has grown over 6 years. So,
yeah.
this was your first time, but many people have been there for 2 or 3 times. Everybody's
Mm,
quite open. We want to be very kind. It's really important to us that this is a very kind community. They're very welcoming, very
mm,
warm. And communities always start as I think a famous sociologist whose name I forgot once said, as pseudo communities where there's a mission and a declaration of intent and shared values. But then it takes a while and usually a crisis or real challenges for
mm,
communities to become real, right? So they become
mm,
really a body and vibrant and alive if they've gone through some crisis together and they've been tested.
mm,
And we had some of these social experiments, and COVID was a big factor in that regard.
yeah.
It really brought people together and helped us grow the community. Yeah, so that's the key question for us. How can we maintain that intimacy, and yet we want to also grow the community and scale it? And that of course, is an interesting tension.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Is it so? What does success look like for you in terms of this, or what I don't, maybe that's not the right word, but like, how would you know that this is on the right track, or that you've been doing the right thing? Again, this sort of, I don't want to make this a technocratic reduction to metrics of some sort, but there's this probably something you're trying to use to gauge whether you're doing well. Other than maybe there's the growth is one aspect of it, I suppose. But how would you ultimately know that, yeah, this is really what we wanted to do and look, it's happening?
It's definitely the growth overall, right? So we look at,
Mm,
are we expanding our footprint? Is there resonance in other markets?
mm,
We're exploring actually going into on a different continent also with some of our events next year, and beyond
mm,
Europe and the US. And I think that's one thing, and we're quite enamored by these local hubs and just the amount of activities there. So that's a sign that there's a certain stickiness, and that the fact that people stay in the community, and then sometimes they do less or they drop out a little bit and then they come back and become a little bit more active. That's totally fine. But
mm,
I think most people, once they're in the house, they value the connection. Secondly, I mean, we do all this stuff like net promoter scores, and we do surveys, and we look at whether that's in our client work or the festivals, the festival that we create and the events that we create. We of look at retention scores and satisfaction scores. Um, with the client work and the work that we do inside organizations, we look at repeat business. We are very keen on moving beyond the intervention. So once we intervened and we staged one experience, that we have champions in the organization that help us, just really grow our footprint there and influence them. And I mean, what I would love to see, what my co-founder and I think our community would love to see, is just much more influence, right? Much more influence. So I think in a sense, we want to be a more recognized voice on our let's take generative AI and the future of work in light of generative AI. Can we develop a point of view? Are we a community that can bring something to the table there that is not part of the conversation yet, but that needs to be heard? Can we bring the talent, like the very unique, eclectic talent that is in our community? Can we bring that into organizations in a much more concerted way? Can we infiltrate these organizations? Can we create more change makers and ambassadors within these organizations? Can we really become a movement that is producing very interesting, very unique, genre-defying work, that will be remembered and that encourages people? I mean, I love this word courage, because it comes from heart. That gives people the heart to live their business life differently, and then themselves become more courageous and inspiring others. So it's hard to quantify. We do have some metrics in place, of course, also because we have investors. We're a business. We want to grow. Yeah. We're quite ambitious. We're encouraged by the recent festival a lot. I think that was really great to see how people responded to that. But as I said earlier, I think the challenge is also, how do we grow this without commodifying it, and still being very intimate and very special, and also this sort of rebellious, subversive spirit that is also part of our brand.
Yeah. No, I think it's super important work y'all are doing, because I think, ultimately for a lot of people, the temptation is to make, especially if you're in the business world, to make everything around, about profit and about success. But business is a means, right? Business is a way in which you bring something valuable into the world, in which you solve a problem, and I think that it can be a means to also enhance our humanity, to bring that to the fore, rather than crush it. And then too often, I think when we lose the focus and get our priorities wrong, I think it ends up dehumanizing us, and that's a lot of what we're seeing, I think, in the work world, where people, instead of making profit of the means, it becomes the end, and then it starts to lead us astray. Talk about your new book. What are you working on, and what are you hoping to do?
It's just been such a struggle, Brandon. It's one of these projects that had a lot of false starts, and it's a difficult birth, which also shows me that it's funny. I was recently at dinner, and I said, this book is just not going to come to pass. I don't know what it is. I just don't have time for it. I never find the time for it. And that person basically turned to me and responded and said, no, it's basically, it's not, you're not ready for it. That the idea is maybe not there yet. It's not the time thing. And I think both is probably true. It's a difficult birth. And the book is about mysticism and management. So in a way, it's a continuation of the journey that I started with the business romantic. There, I delved into the romantic world and the world of exuberant and unquantifiable emotions as an added dimension, as an uncovered dimension, undercovered dimension of business. But even that now strikes me as maybe perhaps too shallow. So I think what I'm now interested in is let's go even deeper into what I mentioned earlier, sort of the subconscious, the unconscious, the spiritual side of our being, really the mysterious, mysticist aspects of our being. And there's so much knowledge in that. And what I've observed also through the work at the house and the people we curated is that there's really been a trend towards that. And I think what I'm struggling with, quite frankly, and I'm working on the proposal now. I've interviewed a bunch of people, and I'm just creating a body, like a table of contents and some drafts, but it's been really going on for almost 1.5 years now. What I'm struggling with a little bit is that I'm not naturally like, I'm not really engaging in these practices. So I'm more of a keen observer who's very curious about
Mm,
them and interested in them. And so I think I'm struggling a little bit with like, is how personal I want this book to be? Is it a
mm,
reportage? Am I just calmly observing what's happening and interviewing people? And I do think because it's been such a difficult birth that there's something like I'm going through this like transformation, and it is a very personal project, and so
huh.
it needs to be it needs to come out, but I think it probably needs a bit more time. Yeah.
Hmm, hmm, hmm. Wow, wow. Well, thanks for sharing that, and I do hope that it comes to fruition because I think it
Yeah. I
would
hope
be
so
very
too
important, and
eventually.
I think whatever journey you're on, I think will benefit all of us. So, um,
We'll see.
yeah, yeah, Tim, thank you so much. I'm so grateful for again for this interview, for this conversation, and it's been such a pleasure getting to know you a bit more. Where can we direct our viewers, our listeners, to your work and to what you all are doing?
The best destination is the House of Beautiful Business website. It's www.houseofbeautifulbusiness.com. Google it, subscribe to our bi-weekly newsletter called Beauty Shots. That's a good window into the house community. Join one of our online sessions. Yeah, read up on us and come join us. Come to one of our events. The
Fantastic.
door is open of the house, always.
Yeah, I highly recommend it. Do you have a tip of some sort for any of our viewers and listeners who might want to infuse more beauty into their work life or to make their business more beautiful? One point that you could leave them with?
2 points. So one would be just take your team and take them to take them to a concert, a movie, or a theater play, and then let that sink in, and then talk about it. Take the time to talk about it. You'd be amazed how such simple endeavor will actually open up new perspectives and actually change the
Mm,
relationship you have. The second tip I have is silent dinners. We've done many silent dinners with clients, and there is something so powerful about dining silently for 90 minutes with colleagues or strangers, not saying a word, but actually connecting on a very deep level. Like everything will change after that. I promise you. So those are fairly easy to pull off activities that I highly recommend.
wow, that's I used to when I was an undergrad, I used to visit a monastery to get a break from, to yeah, get a break from my studies and they would it was an instituted practice that the meals would be silent, and it was quite an experience every time. So fantastic. Thank you, Tim. Really grateful.
Thank you so much, Brandon. It's been a pleasure.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you liked that video, please hit that thumbs up button and share it with your friends. Also, please take a second to hit the subscribe button because it really helps us out. Thanks.